Before I progress further, I would want to kind of say that I'm not a magician. I don't kind of claim that in 1 hour I will be able to teach you the entire aspects of mergers and acquisitions. The objective is to kind of explain what are the different types and kinds in which mergers happen, why they happen, what are the factors which play behind it, and give the audience a better sense of how practically things will be applied. So with that, I would like to say that there are some key subjects which I would like to cover. One, I would say, what is mergers and acquisitions? A very fancy word, and there's this uh, about what 5-7 years back there was this Netflix series, Suits. It still goes on, I think, but and you'll see that the lawyer comes in, and within 1 minute he will find out one piece of paper and he will put it in front of the other side, and the other side will look flabbergasted, and like some huge massive transaction gets over. I mean, that happens only in Suits and in Hollywood. It doesn't really happen in the real world. So in this real world, what happens, I will try and kind of explain a little bit. uh, we'll talk about M&A as a specialized area. What is the future? How are things going on? Whether it is something which law students should be, law students or young lawyers should be interested in. What are the different strategies people have? Why do they do these M&As? Technology. Right now, I have done sessions for plea where I used to go and meet students and young lawyers in a physical space. Now, as you know, because of this pandemic situation, everything is kind of online, and technology and the use of technology is very important. So and that has also percolated in the M&A space. So I'll explain how things are happening. And last, I will just leave a few pointers to keep in mind vis-a-vis what makes a good M&A lawyer. Now, first is, what is M&A? If you are doing any kind of buying, selling, combining or dividing entities, it will be some sort of an M&A. And for every one of these actions, there is a reason. So I wanted to spend time to explain by giving you practical examples. Say, for example, you have a milk production company. And when I say milk production, I mean that you are taking milk from the farmers who are rearing cows, and then you are packaging it and then distributing it to various people. Maybe processing or pasteurizing it and then giving it to different people. This is your business model. You are doing very well. Now you want to foray into different dairy products. Say, for example, you want to have a plant where you make curd, or you want to have a plant where you do powdered milk. And you see that there is another smaller company who is already doing this. So you have two options. One is you buy land, build a plant, get the licenses, or you consider that, okay, this is another company which is there. Let me kind of buy that company, or let me take a stake in that company, so that I have that as a part of my business as well. This is what we call as inorganic growth, where I am acquiring something which is of someone else and growing my business. So now not only am I supplying milk through the ordinary channels that I have, I also have a plant where we are processing milk or processing other dairy products. Similarly, this will be true for most of these industries. Say, for example, uh, suppose you are in the business of uh, you know say iron bars. Now you are doing iron bars. You want to set up a separate establishment where you can do iron sheets. Now again, you are faced with the two aspects: whether you can either do it on your own, or you can buy a company which can which is doing it, and therefore you acquire it. And there are various factors. It is not these are only few things which I am trying to explain. Say, Say we talk about, we use fancy words here, horizontal and vertical integration. Horizontal integration is where, there is something down the supply line that I want to do. Whereas, that is vertical integration, but where there may be something which is horizontal, where, in the same process, I might want to add more things into. So from that perspective, there are various drivers which drive M&A. Say, for example, there is, you've heard about private equity, venture capital. A lot of private equity and venture capital transactions are taking place. Now, those guys have financial returns as one of their, objectives. So the company needs capital, and the private equity investor needs returns on investments. So the the factor which is driving that M&A would be financial returns. So effectively, there are various key drivers which force or which drive the decision in relation to whether a merger and acquisition needs to happen or not. Say, for example, and many of you will resonate with it, that there is a company which has two, three businesses. Say one is, insurance business. Two, there is some real estate business, and three, there is some stockbroking business. Now, in the insurance business, maybe it's doing very well. In the stockbroking business, also, it is doing very well, but it is not doing so well in the real estate business. So they may decide that, look, I can't do all three businesses properly. So maybe I should sell off the real estate business to someone else so that I can concentrate on my insurance business and my stockbroking business. And that would be, a divestment. Now, whatever you say, there are like I've said, there are various drivers. And eventually you will be either buying, selling, or combining entities. So with that as the, backstory, we should just spend some time figuring out what are the different aspects of M&A, M&A, mergers and acquisitions. So what is it? What is the merger and acquisition? Say, for example, we have this company A and this company B. Now, these guys, are the shareholders of A, and these guys are the shareholders of B. Now, through a court, and we'll talk about the different processes in a bit, but just let's think and put to you that this is a court-driven process. In a court-driven process, what happens is that you submit a scheme to the court, and you say, so the shareholders of A and the shareholders of B agree that, we will form one combined entity where A is the shareholders of A are also a party, shareholders of B are also a party, and we have this combined entity which is A plus B limited. So this is a ordinary, the quintessential definition of merger. Now, mergers and acquisitions can happen in two ways. Essentially, I don't want to complicate the stories for any of you. It will happen ordinarily in two ways. What is it? You either acquire the assets or business of the company. What does that mean? Say, for example, and I'll give you these examples later also, but just because this diagram will be easier. Company A has, say, two businesses. One, like let's go with the milk business, the milk business or the milk distribution business. And two, it has the milk processing business. So these are the two businesses that they have. But now it's finding it very difficult that, this milk processing business I can't do. I am not being able to, penetrate the market. So what they want to do is they sell it off on as a whole, the business of milk processing, they sell off. And that is what it will be the acquisition of an asset or business. So you can either buy out your assets or your business, and I'll talk about that in a bit, or you buy shares or you take control. And this acquisition of assets or business can either happen by an asset sale, a slump sale, or like we mentioned, it is by way of a court merger. And similarly, the acquisition of shares can happen either by way of a share purchase or share subscription, or in a contractual manner. Obviously, as you know that lawyers try to complicate things, and also now clients like to complicate things for us. So there is obviously a potential that there are different structures which follow, and I will explain. But before I go, I had a question for the group, just to understand what is the sense of the audience. Does anyone in the audience kind of know what is a share purchase and what is a share subscription? Do you know the difference between the two? Anybody?
Share subscription is when a company comes out with a kind of IPO or a follow-up offering where they want public to subscribe to shares. And share purchase is something which a person does in the stock market, or bulk deals are done on the market, or off-market deals where the shares are purchased and sold. That is in brief I know about share purchase and share subscription.
Okay. And if I may ask you, very interesting and absolutely right answer, but I wanted to, so this is obviously in a public listed company. So when you are going for a listing, you have an IPO or a public offering, or what you call a follow-on offering. But what happens if it is an unlisted company?
Yeah, so in unlisted company, there are financial institutions or the banks who work with these companies. They sell this to HNI individuals or possible investors. That way it works.
Okay. So very good. Just one small thing I want to add is add to what you said is, do remember that share subscription means that it is a new property which is being issued by the company. So in a listed company, you have an IPO. It is a new share of the company which is being given to Mr. X. But if I, as Yashojit, already have shares of a company and I sell those existing shares to Mr. X, that is what we call a share transfer or a share purchase by X. So in one, there is new property which is coming in, and in the other, there is existing property which is transferred. So in going back to this, although this I'll try see if I have, yeah, so we'll use it in the next slide. So fair enough. So this is the difference. The key difference between share purchase and share subscription is share subscription, new property, share purchase, existing property being transferred. Similarly, there are ways in which, I don't know whether anybody of you all have heard concepts of pooling arrangements, where, two shareholders decide that, okay, they will vote in a certain manner. Now, contractually also, parties can agree with each other to kind of, you know, have certain arrangements in place whereby they acquire control. Say, for example, there is a company which has A, B, and C. Each of these hold 33% shares. Now, A and B have an arrangement between them saying that, if there is any matter, we will vote together on that matter, which then automatically means that together acting, they are holding 66% of the votes as opposed to 33% of C. So effectively, they have acquired control of the company without even doing any share purchase or subscription. Now, trying to explain a little more about this A, which is the acquisition, and which is very prevalent nowadays in the legal fraternity. So what, let's look at this example. This will help you guys. So this is ABC Limited. ABC Limited has two businesses, the real estate business and the brokerage business. Now, what these guys want to do is that, look, I am not able to, or I see that the brokerage unit is a very profitable business. So let me do something. Let me sell this business out to PQR. So PQR buys this brokerage unit and pays consideration to ABC. So the money is over here in ABC. Now, if this is what happens if there is a slump sale of the business. But if ABC decided to sell its shares to PQR Limited or to the shareholders of PQR Limited, then these shareholders would have got these shares of this entire company. So understand the difference. This is a very interesting difference which I want to explain. If you do a slump sale, you are only selling off the real estate unit and the money is coming from PQR directly into ABC and PQR is holding only the brokerage unit. But if the shareholders of PQR decide to buy the entire shares of ABC, then you are not getting only an asset, you are getting this entire block. And that is the difference, because in that case you are getting the entire company and not only the brokerage unit. That is how we establish a difference between share purchase and asset transfer or business transfer. Similarly, if you did not want to, only buy the business, you saw that, okay, in the real, say for example, you now want to keep the real estate unit. And in the real estate unit, you have 5 real estate properties. You decide that, no, I don't want to sell off the entire real estate business. I want to sell off only 2, 3 properties. Then you will enter into what we call an asset transfer agreement. A slump sale business transfer is typically a business transfer on an going concern basis, which is typically whatever assets and liabilities are of the business are transferred as a whole to the other. Whereas if you decide to choose that, okay, there are 2, 3 properties that I have and I want to transfer only those 2, 3 properties, then to that extent, it will be an asset transfer and not a business transfer. Now, I'll just spend 5 more minutes on this slide I have. Let us now understand that what is a share subscription and a share purchase. So suppose that YM is holding 100% of a certain company A. Now I am negotiating a transaction with Mr. ABC. Assume I'll give you a practical example so that you will be able to, kind of uh, understand it better. Say I am the owner of I see my cell phone. I am the owner of my cell phone company. Now there is another cell phone company who wants to acquire my company because they think that I have great reach in the Indian market. So they say that, okay, I want to acquire your company because the Indian market is huge. In this case, there are 2 things which can happen. One is that YM, who is holding the shares of this company, sells his entire shareholding to PQR Limited. Say, for example, in this case, I am the shareholder of this company. I sell my shares to this company, which means that then PQR becomes the owner of ABC. There is another alternate where PQR may decide that, look, I don't want to, sorry, I'll just go back one step. So if I sell out my shares, I'm out. I have sold out my shares, I have taken my money and I have gone away. Now, in the other context, PQR thinks that I am actually bringing some value add, or my inputs to the Indian market are very important and they don't want me to go away. So what they do is that they say, look, you need money to grow. I will invest money into ABC Limited and you issue shares to me. So earlier where YM was holding 100%, now there is an issue of shares where this 100% gets diluted because there are new issues here. And let's say, for example, they become 51%, they subscribe to shares and become 51%. So how does the math work? I'll just explain so that, I know lawyers are not very good at math, neither am I, but I'll just explain it in, simple language. So suppose YM held 100 shares. Now ABC is issued 100 more shares. So effectively, earlier there were only 100 shares and YM held everything. Now in the company there are 200 shares and ABC is holding 100 of that 200, which means that ABC is holding 50% of the company. So that way, ABC has acquired, or in this case, PQR has acquired 50% of the company by putting in more money in this company. In this case, see what happens. Because PQR has only put money in this company, the shareholder, which is YM, did not receive any exit. It is not receiving any cash because the cash is lying here. And lawyers, we will draft, and we'll come and discuss it in the next slide. We will draft documents as regards how this money can be used. So effectively, in a subscription, money comes into the company and YM does not get an exit. But in a purchase, if YM exited, then YM would have taken this money and could have done whatever it wanted with the money. Now, like I said, life is not easy, and lawyers definitely don't make it easy, and neither do clients. So what do the clients, what can the client say? So what the client can say is that, look, Yashojit, I don't like you holding 100% of the company. I am willing to give you an exit, but I really still want you to continue in the business because you know a lot about the business and I want you to, kind of spend some time growing the business. So then what we do is we do a subscription and a purchase where I sell some of my shares in this company to PQR and I get a little bit of money. And in addition, PQR also invests some money and dilutes me further. So again, if I do the math, I held 100, I sell off 25 of my shares, so I am remaining with 75. PQR has put in money, it has got 100 shares, plus I have transferred to him 25. So now they hold 125 shares as opposed to my 75 shares. So this is the way in which we combine different structures and try and meet the objective of the client. Say, for example, I'll tell you how and why it is important. In law school, everybody, when they are doing Companies Act, will, read about issuance of shares, purchase of shares, or transfer of shares. But, when we have to actually apply it in the real world, we have to think about what and why is a certain action required or not. Say, for example, I will, kind of put a question to you and see how you think about it. Now, there is a company, ABC, who is, held by, let's say, YM. YM holds ABC. And ABC wants to acquire other companies, but it does not have the money to do so. What do you think you would do if anybody has any thoughts? I'll repeat the question, very simple. YM holds ABC. ABC is doing well, but it does not have adequate money. And in order for its expansion of business, it wants to acquire XYZ. Now there is a new investor which is coming. What can ABC do? Anybody? Should they do a subscription or should they do a purchase?
Hello.
Yes.
Basically, in this case, YM would basically go for the subscription mode because in this process, he also does not lose the control of his ongoing concern. he remains an holder of the shares, and also the new capital infusement can be come from the investor, and then the overall objective of the acquiring of a new asset or a new business can also be achieved. So all three aspects can be achieved via subscription method.
Perfect, perfect. Now let me ask you the question. Say for example, YM is an old man and YM is continuing to run ABC, but YM says that look, I can't, I have done this my entire life. My family is not interested in this ABC business anymore. So in that case, XYZ as an investor comes, what should YM do?
Okay. In that case, basically YM can again go for subscription method, wherein what he says is that he gives a majority stake to the XYZ. Why? Because again that person is very much interested in his business and will make sure that the continuity of the business continues. And again YM can keep the business with him, get some money out of it till
How?
he.
How? Wait. Now
Yeah.
this is the important. See, YM. How will YM get money out of? If ABC is the company, if XYZ infuses money into ABC by way of a subscription,
Yes, but
how will YM get money?
YM is still a shareholder, and whatever the concern makes a profit will also be profit of him. That is the income of him. So
So,
definitely he will be still be making money. He
so
will not
what you
see.
will say, what you're saying is that when XYZ infuses money into ABC,
Yes,
ABC continues with the business. If there are profits, then those profits will be distributed as dividends to YM.
right, right,
So
right.
can I suggest, and this is a very fair point, and if I saw that
Mm.
ABC has great potential, maybe I would have followed this mechanism. And it's a very good example. Like you said, there is no right and wrong answer. Every answer has to have a principle of facts. Now, in this case, like you mentioned, if ABC is a very good company, YM doesn't want to lose ABC. YM continues to be a shareholder. ABC makes profit. ABC declares dividend. YM gets some money on a regular basis over the
Yes,
period of years. But if YM feels that ABC is not doing well, if it feels that look, and I need lot of money. Say for example, I want to buy a house. Dividends will come over a period of years. I may not be able to get. So that time, YM might think that okay, look, it's better for me to completely sell out, make a good chunk of money, and then XYZ becomes the complete owner of ABC. All I want to put through that, like you said rightly, every situation of a merger and acquisition depends on the facts which are explained to you, the needs of the client. If the business is doing well, if YM does not want to get rid of the business, then we will do a subscription. If YM wants to get rid of the business, if YM wants to make a large chunk of money by selling off, then we will have to do a purchase. If YM, say for example, and this is a real life example which I'm giving you, say you would have heard about companies which are owning solar power, solar plants all over the country. Now there is a foreign company who is set up and is operating a solar plant. It decides that look, I have had enough of India. I cannot right now manage this Indian process. I have this other company, just I'm taking a name because it's very big in the market, say Adani Green. Adani Green is looking at assets in the renewable space. Let me make money. Let me sell off my asset to Adani Green and get out of the company and mitigate my country risk. So in that case, a share purchase will be the only viable option. Whereas in a case where Adani Green and XYZ, which is the foreign company, want to both contribute to this solar asset, you would do a share subscription, or you could even do a share subscription and part purchase. So the bottom line of this thought process being that always remember, every transaction will have facts. Every transaction will need you to think about what is it that your client seeks to achieve. This brings me to the next slide, which is where we talk about what are the different aspects which you need to keep in mind when you are talking about a transaction. And why did I spend so much time on the earlier slide? It is because of this one very important point. This is where, every one of us as lawyers will, spend some time. What do I mean by it? When the client comes to you, the client is not going to be telling you, I want this subscription, that purchase, this, that. It will not tell you that. It will tell you his real life story, what he wants to achieve from a business perspective. Just to give you an example, suppose, just think about it. There is company A. Company A has a lot of debt and it is struggling to meet its requirements from its ordinary cash flows. And company A is law. You have decided that your company A is lawyer, and the company promoter, which is Mr. XYZ. Mr. XYZ comes to you and says that, look, A is in a bad situation. I'm looking at an investment transaction. What should I do? In that case, you have to assess the facts. You know that company A is debt ridden. So you have to bring money into the company and utilize that money to pay off the debt. So you have two options in front of you. Either you do a slump sale or asset transfer, or you do a fresh capital raise in the company. So then when you are speaking to the counterparty, you will say that, okay, why are we not looking at a share subscription model? And that's when you try to do structuring. The counterparty may tell you, I'm again giving practical examples. The counterparty may tell you that, look, I would happy to do a subscription, but you know what? Your company has a lot of litigation. I don't want to be a party to all this litigation in the future. So I don't want to take part of your company. So when you had started off thinking that you are going to do a subscription. But when the counterparty raised the argument that, no, I don't want to do, there's a lot of tax litigation or there's a lot of litigation in the company which I don't want to be a party to, you have moved and said, okay, then can we consider an asset sale? Can we consider a slump sale? So that is what we consider as structuring. We structure the transaction so that it meets the commercial objectives of the clients. Now, once you have agreed on the structure, say for example, in this structure, you have said, okay, I am going to do a share subscription agreement. So I do a share subscription agreement and I will pump in money of X dollars into the company. And then you will start discussing, okay, how many board seats will you have? How many, affirmative votes will you have, etc. Those are the concepts are something which we can take up at a later section. I don't want to get into the various nitty-gritties of a shareholders agreement, but principally I say that you decided over here that you are going to do a share subscription agreement. Now you have a basic document, which is the term sheet, which is typically non-binding. Typically a non-binding document where you just note down the key aspects of what you are trying to cover. And then on this basis, parties start the due diligence process and the documentation process, which is this process. So they start drafting documents. They will, kind of negotiate documents, but I will come to that. So you start the due diligence and you start the drafting. Now, can anybody tell me what is a due diligence and what is the legal principle? See, we are talking practical, but everything which is practical has a legal basis. Can anybody try and tell me what is the legal basis of what we understand as due diligence? Anybody aware of the principle of caveat emptor?
So due diligence is that the client would have claimed a certain facts in his account statement, balance sheet, assets, and all that, right? So that needs to be verified whether they actually exist or not. So that is the kind of due diligence. And like you very rightly pointed out and gave a hint about caveat emptor, buyers beware, right? So any buyer who is interested in the business would like to go into deep and analyze whether what all has been claimed and shown to him is actually existing, or it is a defunct company which is being dressed up like a very profitable venture.
Perfect.
So,
I couldn't have answered it better. I couldn't have answered it better. I think that you hit it directly on the spot. And my friends, as he said, I have nothing to add. As he said, you know, the buyer is checking whether what I have said I will pay for. I said I have one, two, three, four, five, six things in the company. I have these revenues coming from here. I have this distribution chain. I have so many long-term contracts. I want to check whether those are all right. Now I figure out that, boss, you told me there are 7 contracts. I figure out that, boss, these are not 7 long-term contracts. You have only 3 long-term contracts, and the other 4 long-term contracts are not long-term. They can be terminated at will. Then I come and tell you, look, boss, I'm sorry. I was in the term sheet. I had agreed that I will pay you 100 rupees. But in the due diligence, I figured out that this 100 rupees is not working for me. Why? Because you had told me that this was on the basis of 7, but I have figured out this is only 3 and 4 are only short-term contracts. So I'm not willing to pay out 100. I am willing to pay out only 80. And that is where we talk about what we call a final valuation. Parties agree. So now I will say, no, 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 boss, you are looking at it wrong. You are looking at it wrong. It is still a long-term contract. I have having this agreement from 2008. It does not have a 20-year period, but it is a year-on-year automatic renewal, and we have been continuously servicing this for last 18 years. So don't worry about it. This is actually, for all practical purposes, a long-term contract. So we start negotiating. And once we have negotiated, we come up with a valuation number of 80. By that time, you have already started your drafting of documents and you discuss. And over here, the documentation has become final. So there are terms of agreement which are finalized. For example, in a case you would have a share subscription agreement or a shareholders agreement. You have these agreements and you execute. Execute means you actually sign the document. Now, in a transaction, it is not always possible that uh, execution immediately doesn't result in funds, and I'll explain to you why. Say, for example, there is a principle called the conditions precedent. What does it mean? It means that, look, we have executed a document, we are both absolutely in sync and want to get on with the transaction, but we have to finish certain conditions before we go. For example, in that one contract which I said was a short-term contract, you said that, look, you told me that this is a long-term. You're now I found out it's a short-term. And in the negotiations, it comes out that, look, don't worry, it is a long-term contract. I will speak to the counterparty and I'll get it to be long-term. Okay. You told me you'll get it done. Great. So as a condition precedent to the transaction, please go and re-execute this document as a long-term contract. And if you do that, then we will close. The closing is the actual time where monies are transferred to each. So in a transaction, if you don't have any conditions precedent, you can directly from execution go to closing. But typically, in transactions, multiple in larger transactions, which you will see when you have spent some time in the industry, you will have certain conditions which need to be completed before closing takes place, and then only closing takes place. Now you are a good negotiator. You say that, look, I can't get this contract done as a condition precedent. It will take me time. I will need to go to ABCD to ask for their consent. So what I will do, you pay me the money, I will get it done after closing. So there may be situations where some of these items which you said that you have to do as a condition precedent, I come back and say nahi 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 ye nahi ho sakta, isme time lagega, so we will do it post the closing, and that is what we refer to as post closing steps. So just as a quick recap, because this is very important. Number one, you have your structuring, speak to the client, figure out what he wants, figure out how you want to achieve it, jot it down in a simple non-binding manner, starts the due diligence process and the drafting process. If there are issues in the due diligence, there can be a discussion on valuation. If there is no issue, obviously you will go and finalize the documentation between the parties and the lawyers. You sign the documents. If there are conditions required to be fulfilled, you finish it off and then move for closing. Closing is the key part where there is exchange of funds. Now, coming to the situation of future of M&A as a specialized area. Everybody knows that, you know, India is a growing and developing economy. There is a lot of M&A activity which is happening. Corporate commercial law is here to stay within our post-liberalization space. Even if you see, there are foreign direct investments have been liberalized, and we are seeing investments happening whether from abroad or even domestic. So from that perspective, there is a large scope of M&A in the general legal fraternity, and it is definitely something which law students and young lawyers have a lot of potential in. Now, when we talk about the strategy, what do we mean? You know, the strategy is something which you have to think about. Every client, and there are various aspects we have written. What I want to explain to you is what you have to think about as a lawyer. The business person will come to you and explain to you why you need or he needs the deal done. It is your responsibility to understand that and then explain to him what his objectives are and how that can be achieved. Say, for example, if a private equity investor comes to you and says, I want to put in this amount of money. So you will ask him, okay, when do you look at your returns? How long are you investing for? If a private equity investor comes to you and tells you that, look, I am interested in this huge IT company. So then you will think, okay, it's an IT company. Okay, so what kind of intellectual property does it have? Does it have any proprietary software? Is it a product which can be easily replicated? If he doesn't have any intellectual property, suppose he doesn't have any intellectual property, is it something which can be easily replicated? Do you have a first mover advantage, or are you going to be coming in next? So you are fighting with someone who has already kind of established in the market. So those are strategies which you will think, you will examine, and you will have a conversation with the client and finally come up with a solution for it. Now, technology, technology has, kind of taken it to a different level. What do I mean? Nowadays, when I was, I'm talking about 2003, when I started my, you know, initial days of being an associate, we had to go visit the client's office, sit for days on end for review of documents. We were not allowed to take copies. We had to make notes there and then. And it was a very painful process. Nowadays, with obviously, I mean, it has increased manifold during the COVID period, but even before, we have now more or less moved to a virtual data room where you can access documents. Like, for example, in our office, associates are working from all over the country. They're logging on to the portal, they are reviewing the documents, making their notes, and proceeding with the documents from wherever they are. So it is on a virtual data room. There is a process I have written, say for example, Kira. It is a software which is available, where you won't believe if I say it. So you just upload certain documents onto Kira and you tell Kira to search for ABCD things. Kira within minutes will throw out results for you. It is then making it so much easier for junior lawyers to, only go through those aspects which Kira has already identified to check whether it is right or whether it is wrong. It is just a double check mechanism. Every one of you have already uh, worked somewhere. I mean, even in law school when we were small, we worked with SCC online. And similarly, there are newer search based engines where there are AI powered legal information retrieval systems, which I've mentioned something about case 9. Litera, when I was a young kid, my partner would have told me that I want cross referencing check. Now you press a button on a document and cross referencing errors will come out and you can kind of see through. So all I'm saying is technology has a tremendous impact, and if as young lawyers you embrace technology, it is going to help you exceedingly. Earlier we used to have to type paragraphs after paragraphs because of the due diligence. Now Kira will throw up that paragraph. You just have to check whether that is right or wrong, whether it is see, because remember, I mean, I'm only talking about Kira now. See, Kira is doing a search, but you are the brains. You are looking at the context. So whether if it's an indemnity clause, Kira has seen the word indemnity and it has put it out for you. You look at the context of indemnity and then adapt it. Typically, Kira is right, but it is a one additional check which we are doing, but the junior lawyer is doing, and his job has become so much easier with additional use of technology. What makes a good M&A lawyer? An M&A lawyer, if you ask me, I have put in a quote. I want to read out this, and I would want you guys to kind of think through what it is. The Oxford Dictionary says discussion aimed at reaching an agreement. This is what is negotiation. This is uh, as I say, what makes a good M&A lawyer? Your ability to negotiate is a very important aspect of an M&A lawyer. But what is the difference between an M&A lawyer and a litigator? You remember, in a litigation situation, you're in front of court. There is a judge who is taking a call on whether person A is right or person B is right. But as an M&A lawyer, it is not that you are not sitting there to pass judgment on whether you are right or he is wrong. What you need to do is you need to understand what is the requirement of your client and what you need to do to discuss with the counterparty's lawyer and come to a middle ground. Negotiation is the process of submission and consideration of offers until an acceptable offer is made and accepted. I put forward a case, you put forward a counter case. Let us both discuss our concerns with that and come to a solution which makes both of us happy. It is not where I am fighting with you, which is in litigation. I am in a contentious position with you. But in a negotiation, we are working together to come to a middle ground which works for both of us. We need to plan. We need to plan our lives accordingly. You will see, as junior lawyers, I'm sure there are some junior lawyers in the group. You will see that there is a lot of pressure at times. You're working on multiple transactions. Please plan your life. I have to do ABCD things in a planned manner. Understand the needs of the parties. What is it that the client wants? And in that, understand what is most important. Say, I'll give you a real life example. So Now I want to, the last point which I want to leave my group with is, deal breakers. We've heard about this concept of deal breakers. What is a deal breaker? Say, for example, I'll give you a real life fact. There is a client who wants to, who's running a successful, I was discussing with one of the participants here. YM is running this business ABC. YM wants to continue with his business. And YM says that, look, I want to be the CEO. And there is a new investor who comes in. The new investor is saying that, look, I am willing to pay you a lot of money, but I don't want you in the company. At that point of time, you have to speak to your client, figure out that, look, I know that you want to be a CEO and you want to continue running this business. But in this present situation, ABC does not want you to be a part of the business. Do you still want to consider the deal with him? Because if you want to, we can either push back to say that, look, no, I am happy to give you stake. I'm happy to even give you majority stake, but I am not willing to give up the CEO position. If that counter offer is accepted, great. But if that counter offer is not accepted, you need to think that, is this a deal breaker? Is this something which is worth saying that, it was good talking to you, but sorry, this deal can't go through? It needs you to understand, one, what is the most important thing for your client, and two, also understand whether that thing can be achieved or not. And if it cannot be achieved, you also need to know what is that time where you need to walk away, rather than getting into a, of course, there will be some discussions, negotiations, maybe some heated arguments also. But it is that time where you need to, kind of step back, figure out, okay, if I do this, it is going to be extremely risky for my client. Or if I have to take this risk, I have to evaluate with my client whether this still makes sense or not, whether he still will be happy or not, and then proceed. So as young lawyers who are coming in and exploring this aspect of corporate commercial law, I would say, if I have to tell you about two takeaways from this presentation, just two. One, please understand what your client wants. If you understand what your client wants, you will be able to apply the law and come up with a proper structure which works for him. Number two, whenever you're at the table, be respectful to the counterparty. No one in the fraternity is a fool. And many times that's unfortunate, but it's happened. Whenever we are in a negotiation, अरे कुछ नहीं जानता यार, बकवास कर रहा है बॉस, ये इतना इतना फालतू बात कर रहा है. It is a normal, reaction that we have. क्या क्या बोल रहा है यार, कुछ नहीं आता है उसको बॉस. That is not true. He's stupid. He's being overprotective. We say this, and I'm not saying I'm no saint. I have also said it at times. But we have to be mindful of the fact, please respect your counterparty and accept that he may have his own thoughts, he may have his own instructions, and therefore be respectful and try to find a middle ground if you can.
So meanwhile, Yashuji, there is one question in front of me. Sir, what is letter of intent?
A letter of intent is essentially, again, something like the term sheet. If you remember, I had that concept of a term sheet. A term sheet is also known as a letter of intent. Typically, you call it letter of intent, you call it memorandum of understanding, you can call it anything you want. If, as long as it is a non-binding understanding between the parties, it is that, you remember that stage structuring, uske baad term sheet. So that is that stage where you are not yet come up with the definitive documents. You are just generally capturing the understanding of the parties in relation to a transaction. Whether you call it an MOU, whether you call it an LOI, whether you call it a term sheet, it's all the same.
Okay. The next question is, sir, does a M&A lawyer assist the companies in formulating the articles of association after the M&A process?
This is a very interesting question. I'll tell you why. It's a funny one. See, why? First of all, why is this important? And this will come at a later time, but please let me answer that. A shareholders agreement has the rights inter se parties. And there are judicial pronouncements which say that if these rights inter se parties are not reflected as a part of the articles of association, then they will not be binding on the company. So therefore, as an M&A lawyer, what we do is, as a part of the closing process, or let's say I was talking about the CP, as a part of the CP, we will amend the articles of association and keep them in agreed form and adopt those on closing, so that immediately when the money comes in, the articles of association on that day become changed. So if you are looking at an M&A transaction, typically as a closing process, you will kind of change the articles of association. Now, the joke is that the client will want everything. So typically, if you ask me, and if I have to say, it is effectively the job of a company secretary to put it as a part of the articles. But in the practical world, we end up doing it most of the time. And the joke is that once you're paying a lawyer, you get him to do everything rather than pay the lawyer and the CS. So in this case, as in the practical world, you do end up not only doing the articles of association but also doing resolutions or closing resolutions for the clients in an M&A transaction.
The next question is, what is the interconnect between direct tax and M&A?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Let's do a very, say for example, if I do a share purchase. What do I mean? So again, coming back to this, YM holds shares in ABC and YM sells his shares to XYZ. If YM is selling his shares and making money, he will pay capital gains. So then, there will be a tax lawyer who will advise YM as regards what is the capital gains impact on YM. Now let's look at another example. There are situations. Say for example, we talked about, if you remember, in the acquisition, we said asset transfer and slump sale. Now these two are both treated very differently from a taxation perspective, from a direct tax perspective as well as from an indirect tax perspective. So whenever you're coming up with a structure, and there was a structuring sheet, that structuring point will also need inputs from tax lawyers, because what might be a very critical structure or an important structure may not be tax efficient. Say for example, you remember a colleague of ours, a participant over here, was saying that, okay, I fund the company and YM continues to hold shares, and whenever ABC as a company makes money, there will be profits which will be distributed as dividend. So in that case, there will be a dividend distribution tax which will be withheld. So the money which will be actually coming out to YM may be lesser because of this dividend structure rather than a straight sales structure. So when you are coming up with a structure, at that point, it is not only legal, not only has company law aspects, not only has FEMA aspects, but also has direct and indirect tax aspects which need to be considered when you are doing the structure.
The next question is, what precautions need to be taken while drafting a share transfer agreement?
Wow, this is like another session, man. So, typically what you will have to do is you have to look at, how to put it. First, important control. Who is in control of the board? How are key decisions being taken? What happens if there is, say for example, if the board is 2:2? What happens if there is a dispute between the parties? If you are talking only about share transfer, you will talk about, okay, after the transfer, am I left with any responsibilities? Am I undertaking or giving any reps and warranties which can come back and bite me later? Do I need to protect against those? So those are various aspects which we need to think about. And like you have mentioned, there are different agreements where there are different aspects which you need to think through. And same for clients. Say for example, I remember using an example. If a foreign company is wanting to just sell its assets, sell its solar asset to an Indian company and get out, it does not want any liability coming and biting it 2 years down the line. So it will negotiate very hard for limited reps and warranties. It will take, if required, warranty indemnity insurance. So you please, again, there is no one size which fits all. Understand the needs of your client and then think through what is going to be required for your client in the documentation.
Okay, the next question is, sir, is it mandatory to enter into a confidentiality agreement?
Ordinarily, ordinarily you would see, it's not mandatory, not like the law requires you to enter into a confidentiality agreement. But typically, in hardcore transactions, there's a lot of sensitive information floating around, board minutes, or papers in discussion papers, or reports, or financial information. Now, ordinarily you will want to have a confidentiality agreement in place, but it's not like it is mandatory. If you don't have a confidentiality agreement, even then you will have typically a confidentiality clause as a part of your transaction document. So it's not like you go scot free, but you can ask the question that, okay, in that case, what happens if the deal doesn't go through? Yes, then if the deal doesn't go through and you don't have confidentiality agreement, then you will be in possession of certain proprietary information. It might be, you might still be caught for tort, but ordinarily, if you're doing sophisticated transactions, we would have a non-disclosure agreement signed at the inception before we proceed. Thank you so much.